absolute favorite lesson because it deals with a subject I agree with wholeheartedly. That is the banning of alcoholic substances, spirits, as they're otherwise known, from consumption, the evil of drink, the family ruining horrors of alcohol. And therefore, we're dealing with the question of probation. Being such a teetotaler myself, I like to often refer to a book known as The History of Drunkenness, or A Brief History of Drunkenness, because people have been getting drunk for thousands of years. And in his book, Mark Forsyth says, broadly speaking, people have been drinking in the same way for the same reason since time immemorial. There is little difference in the method or reasons for consuming alcohol between the ancient Assyrians and us. And in the 1900s, the early part thereof, the United States sought it fit to amend the Constitution to ban the transport and sale of alcohol for all American citizens. And this period known as Prohibition lasted about 14 years, from 1919 to 1934. The Prohibition came in with the passing of the 18th Amendment. This is something that happened under the Wilson presidency. It's the attempt to ban the sale and manufacture of alcohol. It's probably one of the more bizarre chapters in American history. The bringing about of Prohibition, how it came to be, was really the result of a coordinated social, religious, and political movement, very much affiliated with progressivism, that had deep roots in U.S. history. Prohibition didn't come out of nowhere. It had been sort of on the table in various forms for about 100 years. Since the early 1800s, there had been some examples of alcohol being an issue. In 1833, a group known as the United States Temperance Union, temperance means abstaining from alcohol, had branches in every state, and they encouraged their members and their members to encourage other people to abstain from drink through moral suasion. In other words, making people feel bad about drinking, making them feel guilty. Moral suasion or moral persuasion is a way of making you feel guilty. You may recall, if you think back to, if you've ever learned about the League of Nations, one of the powers of the League of Nations, if you can call it that, was the fact that they could use moral persuasion to convince a country that, oh gosh darn, don't take over that other country because it's really not nice. And that worked really poorly in examples such as Abyssinia, and in the United States, it worked poorly. That is until Prohibition was passed in the early part of the 20th century. One of the key aspects of the banning of alcohol was the fact that there were differences in alcohol. Initially, the temperance unit was against what they called ardent spirits, the hard stuff, gin, whiskey, bourbon, the stuff that packs a large ABV, whereas beer and wine with their relatively low comparative ABV, though they can still get you drunk in a hurry if you drink enough of them, means that these things were probably worse. So there was a relative balancing of alcohol. The first real law against the use of alcohol in the United States was what's known as the Maine Law in 1851, surprisingly passed in Maine. Why Maine? Well, Maine was actually a religious hotbed. That northeasterly corner of the United States was one of the states that was largely populated by a group known as the Quakers. The Quakers are a Protestant religious evangelical group that lives a very frugal, very controlled, contained life, where they follow a fundamental reading of the Bible, and they abstain from anything that could, in their eyes, punish or hurt God's body. The reason Quakers are against alcohol is because they believe that the body is something given to you by God, and poisoning the body or altering your mental state is actually altering the perfection of God. Therefore, the Quakers are really one of the fundamental religious groups behind the Prohibition movement. Their leader in Maine is a man named Neil Dow. He believed that men should abstain from alcoholic beverages because, of course, alcoholic beverages leads men to do things like spend their paycheck on booze instead of their family, treat their wives inappropriately, violence at home, it leads to the breaking up of marriage, etc., etc., etc. And he believed that alcohol would never be stopped by moral suasion alone, that he needed the government to back a law. The Maine law that's passed in 1851 allows for the search and seizure of any establishment selling alcohol if 3 voters complain. So in other words, you can get 3 people together and complain about X tavern down the road or X saloon down the road, and they could search and seize any alcohol that had been sold as long as it's disturbed the public peace. One of the things that actually made the Maine law quite powerful is that the judges who enforced it were permitted to keep the money from fines. So in a very neat little trick, one of the good examples of what gets rewarded gets done is that judges actually pursued this with a relative vigor in Maine throughout the 1850s, simply put, because they made money from it. Okay. By the end of the 1850s, there were 13 states, most of them in New England and the Midwest, that had voted in favor of some form of prohibition. And in terms of political issues at the time, it's probably second only to slavery. And you're all aware that by 1861, the American South secedes and the Civil War begins. And of course, actually, ironically, the Civil War is what will lead to most of these states abandoning laws, because in the midst of a horrific war with millions of Americans dying and the need to get people to go and stand in front of bullets, alcohol actually comes in quite handy. So most of the laws in these 13 states get repealed during the Civil War. By the time the Civil War is over, it ends in 1865, Dow returns to the political scenes in the form of the Prohibition Party, and he will contest 2 presidential elections, having almost no success whatsoever against the Republicans and the Democrats.
So we're going to look at the 2 major movements. I'm just going to echo something Mr. Rain said about the Christian nature of this organization. Before 1900, the temperance movement was predominantly a Christian organization. So why do Christians exist everywhere? What is about American Christians? Now, arguably, the New England, Northeastern Americans is profoundly influenced by Puritans. Puritans are, as mentioned before, relatively radical Protestants who believe that salvation does not come from your priest, it comes from yourself. And you can argue, therefore, this leads to a sense of strong individualism, strong sense of entitlement only to oneself, hard work and caring about only oneself as opposed to anything else. It is not an accident, therefore, that alcohol, something that corrupts one's individualism and which is an individual choice, is something that Christians which adopt this idea that you are responsible for yourself and your own morality is something they target. Now, the first of the 2 movements is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is formed in 1874. Now, this is the classic religious organization. It's not the only one, but it very much emphasizes the religious arguments, has the religious notifications that essentially booze corrupts the soul. If one achieves salvation, achieves goodness, and achieves heaven by working hard, caring about themselves, focusing on improving themselves. Alcohol obviously undermines that. Alcohol is an indulgence. Alcohol is about satisfying one's short-term desire, not long-term gain. And therefore it's that idea of corruption. And the argument becomes, if you allow drink to spread and the carry to be drunk, the people will become corrupted and more indulgent and less Puritan, less Christian. This is bad, is over time, as more people drink and fewer people follow the way of the Bible, that America could in turn become corrupted. And this is the central argument of Women's Christian Temperance Union, that it's not simply drink is bad, we don't want people to drink it, it is they are saving the soul of America, or at least that's how they saw it and argued it. And very much it fits into that. Frances Willard is the first real President Wortherdam. There's a couple of small ones beforehand, but they don't really matter. She is fundamentally popular for this message, maybe not amongst everywhere, but amongst Puritans, because she makes it a religious crusade. It is therefore not an opinion about alcohol. If you are a good, right-standing Christian, you follow this idea of temperance. She's particularly popular amongst women, and it's not an accident that she also, simultaneously to pushing for prohibition, also pushes for women's suffrage and women's right to vote. The logic is the same. By banning alcohol, you are improving the moral standards of America and improving America. By inviting women to vote, you are improving the moral standards of America because women tend to be more moral. That's the argument. And you can see their greatest success in 1880 is passing an amendment in Kansas, a Midwestern state with quite a big support amongst the Christian groups, for prohibition. This is, unfortunately, as successful as prohibition actually will turn out to be. It's difficult to enforce, there's a fight between the dries, no alcohol, and the wets, wanting alcohol, and in reality, saloons continue to exist. Arguably, the economic arguments advanced by the Temperance Union are shown to be false by the 1893 panic, although you could say the panic has got nothing to do with alcohol either way. The classic example for your essays of this sort of religious fervour, which kind of puts people off but sells well to people who are already religious, is Carrie Nation. She would enter saloons, kicking down doors with a hatchet, screaming the Lord's Prayer and various psalms at the top of her lungs, smashing bottles with a hatchet, and talking about how she is the Rottweiler of God, or the Bulldog God.
She also used to throw herself across bar tables and pray, and hitting anybody who tried to kick her off the bar table with the Bible.
Yes. So as you can imagine, this sells quite well to the evangelical groups of the Northeast and Midwest, where you see a lot of those Protestants.
Real fire and brimstone.
Yeah,
so.
really, really plays well. Unfortunately, they are not the majority of America, and therefore there's only so much political power you can get from this. And I think Carrie Nation is very indicative, in that, yes, that plays well, but that does not lead to a national federal reform. If you're going to get federal reform prohibition, you need 2/3 of the Senate, 2/3 of the sort of most conservative, least likely to change the power of government, people to vote for it. This is not enough. However, when we go to the next league, we can see actually this is how progression actually happens. Yes, there is this religious group, and yes, the Anti-Saloon League will have religious parts to it. But it understands if you want change, if you want true prohibition, you need to get a coalition going. A coalition is a group of supporters from various groups and various areas of American society, because otherwise politicians will not listen to you. If you are only a small part of geography, small part economically, small part racially, small part religiously. So the ASL, with its chief counsel, Wayne Wheeler, initially follows the same sort of approach of the Temperance Union by trying to get state reforms, and it is quite successful at getting individual states. By 1913, you can see at the bottom, 20 states had laws enforcing prohibition, although they weren't necessarily successful. However, the ASL also starts moving towards a national prohibition, because they look at what happened in Kansas and they say part of the reason that booze was able to still be drunk is because it could be so easily imported from other states, and therefore the only solution is to ban it in all states, and therefore booze could not get around, and then then it will work. Okay. Now, what was their genius? Well, the genius of the ASL was to keep the religious stuff going and talk about how it's important for salvation and stopping corruption, but also to start reaching out to other groups. Women, it reached out, who were already quite religious anyway, but reached out by associating a lot of the problems that women have with domestic violence, with child poverty and these sort of things, could be blamed on alcohol, and linking their problems and their concerns, the fact they're too poor, with the fact that their husbands drink alcohol, spend the money on alcohol, etc., and that brings them in. Businessmen such as Henry Ford likes their arguments about efficiency and the economic arguments that if we ban booze, we have fewer drunk workers and fewer hungover workers. We have more productivity, less absenteeism, and therefore we see the economy improve. And he really buys into that as well. And with Henry Ford comes lots of money and connections. Henry Ford knows a lot of people in Washington, and now the Anti-Saloon League can start visiting people in Washington because Henry Ford suggests they visit the Anti-Saloon League. And the senator for, say, Illinois knows if he wants to get elected next time, he's going to listen to Henry Ford. So we see again, they play the politics, they play the money, they play that sort of stuff to get some support. No. Pause it. So they get those on the side. As well as that, they start spreading their message and link it to the progressives. They talk about it being good for the family, good for society, good for the economy, good for the USA. Good for the family, good for the society is the same sort of aims of the progressive movement, reforming society to make it better. The beauty of prohibition is many of the progressives are middle-class people who don't really respect poor people, and poor people are kind of lazy, as they see it. Now, if you say banning alcohol, that fits in with their stereotypes of poor people quite nicely, because it's the idea of poor people drinking booze and not helping themselves. Banning alcohol fits with their sort of worldview. Progressive, remember, are not like, oh, I love the poor, they're lovely. It's we need to act in these people's interest, even if they don't know how to act in their own. And so it fits in with that. And very quickly, the progressive movement and all their money and all their connections and all their political skill also get brought into prohibition. And we see a coalition by the 1900s of businessmen, religious groups, women, and the progressive movement all come around prohibition. And therefore we see this massively improved political power. And this is seen in 1907. This is Mr. favourite fact. Oklahoma comes into the USA with prohibition in its constitution. It was a territory before, and the national federal government has to allow it to come into the state. Now, interestingly, it also enables a prohibition clause in the Constitution, showing how at some level the federal government, which could have not allowed that to happen, is enabling prohibition to happen and has been convinced to some extent.
Okay, so One of the next parts is the fact that in order to get a law passed, in order to change something like the Constitution, you have to get an amendment through Congress, and this requires widespread public support. Amendments require at least a two-thirds majority going through Congress, and then it has to be ratified individually by each one of the states in the Union. Now, that's a big deal because if one state diverges, the amendment can fall apart and the Constitution cannot be ratified, or the constitutional amendment can't be ratified. In order to ban the sale of alcohol, which is essentially limiting a human right, you do have to amend the Constitution. Now, what provides the impetus for that? So we've heard about Christian and religious motivation. We've heard about how it's becoming a more organized and important political union. But what really gives sort of the overwhelming push, which makes it a popular movement, is the First World War. The anti-saloon league will argue the fact that the Germans, who are the enemies of the United States from 1917 into 1918 during the First World War, are actually the people who are producing the majority of the alcohol in the United States. Additionally, they argue that it would conserve things needed to feed the soldiers, barley, rye, and wheat, which are the staples of the food needed for the American army overseas. Now, effectively, they say that alcohol, not only is it unpatriotic, it's using up raw resources, and it's undermining the efficiency of the armed forces. Soldiers who are drunk, apparently, can't fight very well. Now, most of the breweries and distillers, and when you really boil it down, happen to be German-American owned. Okay, some of the biggest examples are Anheuser-Busch out of St. Louis, famous makers of the Budweiser beer empire. Okay, Anheuser-Busch, German. Schlitz, one of the biggest brewing companies from Milwaukee, German owned. And it became a patriotic duty, in a sense, to abandon what actually became known as Kaiserbrau, or the Kaiser's beer. Giving up on alcohol was seen as a way to fight the Germans from your living room, if you will. So by 1917, by the time the U.S. enters the World War, already there are lots of dry states. After the declaration of war, Congress will begin to move towards prohibition. They'll start with restricting the use of foodstuffs, i.e., barley and rye, for the production of alcohol, which leads to the sort of a really poor quality beer, which reduces the amount people want to drink it. And then secondly, you get what's known as the Prohibition Act of 1918. This forbids the production of wine and beer and sale of alcohol containing more than 2.75 ABV, which means that you only get what's known as weak war beer. In other words, pointlessly, if you're drinking it to get drunk, beer that can barely make you feel warm inside. The 18th Amendment is finally ratified in 1919. In December 1917, it goes through Congress. But in accordance with the Constitution, all of the states have to ratify the amendment, and this takes a long time. You'll note that from other examples, you may be thinking back to the passing of the 16th Amendment, of course, which was something that was started under Taft, and then was ratified finally by the time Wilson comes around, even though that law is very much Taft's. Keep that in mind. But this is another example. Even though this is all Woodrow Wilson, you get an idea that these amendments take quite a long time to get through the political system. And by 1919, you have the Prohibition Act, okay? And this is known as the Volstead Act. It comes into effect as of January 1920, even though it's passed on October 1919. And the act itself, and it's very important to know the difference, bans not the drinking, but the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages that are above 0.5% ABV, leaving a little bit for the sale of things like rubbing alcohol or different medicines which contain alcohol in them.
One thing I'd like to mention as part of this before we move on is the Southern senators vote for this massively. And it's something we haven't really talked about why. Essentially, the Southern caucus is probably the most powerful in the Senate, and there's no way this will get passed without it. They do not like the idea of the Jazz Age. They do not like the increased drinking of alcohol by black people in their areas. It scares them that the blacks who are kept in order by Jim Crow America under the influence of alcohol may become more violent, may become more bullshit. And therefore, they are very keen for the limits on alcohol, but they also, being a society based around American whiskey-ish things called bourbon, also don't really want to completely ban it because their whole society is based around drinking. So what do? You ban it, but then you make loopholes or you insist upon loopholes, which mean that your society, people in their palatial country homes in the south, can carry on drinking, and that will lead to a lot of the loopholes that we'll talk about in a second. So, what happened? As mentioned, it was never illegal to drink alcohol. The consumption of alcohol was never legal. Okay, therefore, in reality, it's incredibly hard to limit demand. Now, if there's demand, if people can know they can get away drinking it without being criminalised, they will want, if you've been drinking it all your life, there's no reason to stop drinking it. So, apart from moral reasons, that's not going to keep you going for long. So, this only means that there's a huge market should you want to break the law and do the only bit which is illegal, which is to either make it or supply it. Okay, and therefore it can massively ensures that there's lots of money in it for illegal people who wish to sort of break the law, and therefore there's a massive incentive to break the law and ignore prohibition. It's like if we ban drugs, but you could still have drugs and take drugs, that wasn't a problem. Okay, then there's a massive incentive, there's more people willing to buy it. This is one of the big frameworks which the South demanded, for example. Now, therefore, as a result, the authorities cannot focus on finding who has alcohol, quite easy and quite easy to enforce. In reality, it aimed to look at them as they were being transported, because normally they were imported from abroad, or where they were being created. The problem with this is it's very hard to do that, because you've got to catch it in the moment. As soon as it arrives in the homes of Americans, you can't touch it. So in that small gap when it comes into the country to arrive in a saloon or arrives to a person who wants to buy it, it is hard to enforce. The Treasury Department was made responsible for enforcing this, but in reality, there was not much money spent or given to it to enforce it. This is partly because America at the time doesn't want to have a big government and doesn't want to have high taxes, but also a deliberate point by the people who made it in order to limit how far this will be enforced. Because obviously they want it enforced, but not to a great degree. And therefore, we see a massive rise in illegal saloons, known as speakeasies, particularly in urban areas where it's easier, where the demand is high and people are high, and also they can get away with it. A big point to realise, actually, as well as this, is in rural areas, it's really not necessary to have a speakeasy, because another one of the loopholes, again, to help the South, is that farmers can grow their own wine, and that's very easy then, therefore, to sort of sell around. So what happens as a result? Well, because of the poor enforcement, there is very little in the way of reductions in drinking. Now, this is disputed. Some say there's a slight reduction, some say there's a slight increase, some say it stays the same. I would say, for the sake of argument, it roughly stays the same with a slight reduction. Beer sales massively plummet because it's harder to hide brewing. It's hard to hide large quantities of beer. But spirit sales, bottles of whiskey, which can get you drunk much more, actually sell more than ever. 75% of all alcohol drunk are spirits during this period, which arguably then just offsets any gains of reducing beer. The people who really benefit in reality are organised crime. What you've done is you've taken a taxable, regulatable, and relatively legal organisation such as the brewers, although most of them still in operation in this period, and you are taking their business away. But the demand for booze is still there. So who's going to step into that business? Well, people who are not afraid to break the law. And organised crime gangs start on small levels, running booze into certain cities. They then get control of the speakeasies. They then get control of the importation. And then they've got so much money, they can bribe the police, they can bribe the mayors, they can bribe the functionaries, they can bribe the enforcement agents. I mean, they carry on. So what we have is a massive increase, because now there's loads of money to be made in organised crime and corruption. This obviously then leads to competition for this, and therefore gang warfare, the most famous being the 1929 Valentine's Day Massacre, where the Italian mob under Al Capone murder 9 members of an Irish gang in Chicago. This became a sort of cause célèbre and really brought people's attention to something that they knew had been happening all along, which was this is only empowered organised crime. And the big thing is, had people not been able to get away with drinking it as easily, then the demand would not necessarily be there, the money would not necessarily be there, and therefore there'd be less money to bribe, and there'd be fewer organised crime willing to get involved with it. But the critical failure is to make it only about supply and sale, not about consumption.
So, what leads to the end or the repealing of prohibition by the 21st Amendment in 1933? Okay, a few things. Number one, obviously, people become worried and concerned about the growth of organized crime. What they saw is illegal profit-making business has essentially gone over to be padding the pockets of illegal organized crime, and this is obviously bad. So that's number one. So there's public opinion, which was never massively overwhelmingly in favor, particularly in urban areas, of prohibition or towards prohibition, turns against the Volstead Act. The second thing is the fact that President Hoover, who you'll learn about in later lessons, who's in power throughout the late 1920s into the 1930s, is learning from his FBI director, effectively, the Volstead Act was virtually impossible to enforce. Public opinion had turned against what was once known as the Noble Experiment, and people become, especially during the Great Depression beginning in 1929, more concerned about their economic issues than prohibition itself. And there's a massive economic thing around this, too, because people see that alcohol is a profitable business, and they're asking themselves, why are we out of work? Why are we starving? Why are we suffering under the worst of the Great Depression when we could, by the repeal of prohibition, create thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs, both in the service industry, that is the bar industry, and in the production and manufacture of alcoholic spirits, not to mention the transportation industry, which transports it from factory to consumer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People are like, this doesn't make any more sense. In 1933, Hoover is replaced with Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, he wins the election in 32, becomes president in 33, and he passes relatively quickly a winning proposition, which is the 21st Amendment. And this repeals prohibition. It's largely, like I said, done for the economic reasons, but there are other things pushing on it as well. Nevertheless, throughout the United States, and actually to this day, the anti-alcohol lobby, backed by mainstream Christianity, remains quite strong. Many states still keep prohibition all the way into the 1960s. Today, many southern states still have dry counties. Tennessee is half of the counties in Tennessee, including where Jack Daniels is manufactured, is a dry county. You cannot consume Jack Daniels in the county in Tennessee where Jack Daniels is made. In 1984, for instance, to give you an idea of just how important the anti-drinking lobby is, the national minimum drinking age is set at the age of 21. This is the highest in the Western world. Here in the UK, we have a drinking age of 18. In the United States, students have to wait, or kids have to wait 3 years before they're able to ingest a spirit. Now, all that said, here's the easiest way to remember the two amendments relative to this particular course. The 18th Amendment brings in prohibition, that is the UK drinking age, and the 21st Amendment brings out prohibition, and that is the American drinking age. And that's how I remember it, but it might work for you too. So that's the story of prohibition, the noble experiment that failed. We will see you guys next time when we talk about how women are able to further the progressive cause.